March 1971. Britain was preparing for decimal currency. The Rolling Stones were getting ready to record Brown Sugar. Rod Stewart would recall the charms of Maggie May, and Don McLean would sing of the day the music died. In America, a company called Intel was about to introduce a thing called a microprocessor. It was mounted on a silicone chip. In Formula 1, the reigning world champion would not be able to defend his title. Jochen Rindt had died during practice for the Italian Grand Prix the previous September. Racing had also lost Bruce McLaren and Piers Courage. In South Africa, ready for the first Grand Prix of the year, safety was the main talking point. As usual, the start of a new season brought changes and expectations. There were few changes of personnel in the major teams, apart from the fallout from the less than sparkling performance of March in its first season. Mario Andretti and Joe Siffert, both in private Marches in 1970, had gone to Ferrari and BRM respectively. Chris Amon had transferred to Matra, and his place in the factory March team had been taken by Ronnie Peterson. The majority of the field was still powered by Cosworth, but the question was whether the faithful V8, now 4 years old, could maintain its dominant position. The expectation was that the Ferrari V12 was the engine to beat. Following the mediocre showing by the 1970 cars, March had taken a radical step in shape and aerodynamics for 1971. Designer Robin Herd had followed the lead of the Lotus 72 and had moved the radiators from the nose to alongside the driver. But the torpedo shape and pylon-mounted front wing were unique. Jackie Stewart had been approached by Ferrari after the 1970 season, but he preferred to stay with a car that had been designed around him. Chris Amon was hoping that his change to the French Matra could change his luck. John Surtees had a new car that was also designed to his personal tastes, but on a tighter budget than Ken Tyrrell had to keep Jackie Stewart happy. Pedro Rodriguez was content to stay with BRM and its V12 engine, and Joe Siffert was hoping the improving form of the British team would bring him results. Denny Hulme was the mainstay of the McLaren driving talent now Bruce McLaren was gone, and Emerson Fittipaldi was also leading a team that had lost its leader on the track. When practice was over, the grid ran true to form. Stewart was fastest, Skill and a Cosworth beating the 12-cylinder cars of Amon, Regazzoni and Andretti. Next came Fittipaldi, Surtees and Hulme, all sharing the same time. Surprisingly, they were ahead of Ixi's Ferrari, but Stewart made a poor start. Regazzoni was the early leader, but Denny Hulme's new McLaren was proving very competitive, and after 16 laps he moved ahead of the Swiss driver. Amon's Matra was going well, as was Wiessel's Lotus, but the going was too hot for the BRM drivers. Rodriguez retired with burned feet, and Ganley was overcome by the heat just after the race's halfway point. Hulme had no such problems and appeared to have the race in the bag. But with just 4 laps to go, the McLaren's suspension collapsed, leaving Denny to stagger home 6th. The man that took over the lead was Mario Andretti. This was only his 10th Grand Prix since late 1968, for he combined his F1 activities with a full programme of racing in the US. To drive for Ferrari in Formula 1 fulfilled a boyhood dream, and to win the first race in which he drove for the Prancing Horse stable was the ultimate achievement. Although his passport may have been American and his residence in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, his heart was Italian. Behind Andretti came Jackie Stewart and Clay Regazzoni. With 2 Ferraris and a Tyrrell in the first 3 places, it looked as though the form book was being followed. It rained during practice for the Spanish Grand Prix held on the Montjuic Park circuit in Barcelona, but the forecast for the race was fine. The drivers of the 12-cylinder cars at Ferrari, Matra and BRM were happy. The power of their engines could have been an embarrassment if the circuit, which twisted its way up and down the hills of a public park, was wet. Ferrari's win in South Africa, together with success at the end of the previous season, had made the cars from Maranello favourites here, but the other 12s were also fancied, and although March was relying on unconventional aerodynamics, engine power was still seen as the key to success. The grid backed up the predictions, for 6 of the first 8 qualifiers had 12-cylinder power. The front row was Ickx, Regazzoni and Amon, while Stewart was the first Cosworth runner. He was followed by Rodriguez, Beltoise, Gethin, also with a Cosworth in his McLaren, and Andretti. Ickx made the most of his pole position at the start and leapt into the lead. Diademic, in the Alfa Romeo-powered March, was the slow starter. Slow motion shows just how hard the cars and drivers were working on the twisting Montjuic circuit, with its requirement for hard braking into the corners. This race was the first in which slick tyres had been used. Goodyear had provided tyres with minimal tread pattern in South Africa, but here Firestone had the first completely smooth tyres, developed from those used in American drag racing. The fact that Saturday's practice was wet meant that many of the drivers were having their first real experience of driving on slicks in the race itself. The advantages, however, soon became obvious, and slicks would soon become universal in dry conditions for Formula 1. There were now just 2 companies supplying tyres for Grand Prix racing. Dunlop had pulled out at the end of 1970, unable to match the spending of Goodyear and Firestone, the 2 American giants. Ickx's domination of the start had only been temporary. After 4 laps, Jackie Stewart passed the Belgian and began to build up a lead. Once again, the combination of Stewart's skill, the Tyrrell chassis and the best that Cosworth could provide was enough to overcome the attack of the 12-cylinder cars. The Ferraris of Regazzoni and Andretti dropped out with mechanical failures, but Stewart's closest pursuers, Ickx, Ferrari, Amon, Matra and Rodriguez, BRM, all had 12-cylinder engines howling at their backs. For much of the latter part of the race, Stewart was busy lapping other Cosworth-powered runners. Only Denny Hulme in his McLaren was on the same lap as the Scott and the 3 12-cylinder cars as the final flagfall approached. The Spanish Grand Prix was unusual in that it was run in the morning, and many of the spectators would leave immediately after the finish because they had tickets for the bullfights. For the drivers, however, the great thing about a free afternoon in the days before private jets was the opportunity to catch an early flight home. For Jackie Stewart, the afternoon off was well earned. Ickx had pushed him hard in the latter stages of the race, and he later described it as the toughest of his career so far. Chris Amon, in his second outing for Matra, had proved the potential of the French chassis and engine with a confident 3rd place. As he joined Jackie and Helen Stewart on the podium and on a lap of honour, he had every reason to be optimistic about his prospects. But the Tyrrell team must have felt even more confident. The increasing popularity of Formula 1 brought a record crowd to Monaco for the most glamorous Grand Prix of the season. By now, this race was an established fixture in the calendar of the beautiful people, and this in turn increased its appeal for the ordinary fan. But if the people were beautiful, the weather for the practice sessions was not. 2 out of the 3 days brought heavy rain, and Friday was the only day when the qualifying times meant anything. This was rotten luck for Mario Andretti, whose Ferrari broke down during the dry session in a place where he could not get back to the pits to fix it. There was no way he could put in a good time during the downpours of Thursday and Saturday, and he failed to qualify for the race. Those who did qualify well were Stewart, Ickx, Siffert and Amon, and once again there were 5 12-cylinder cars in the top 8. But nobody seemed to have told Jackie Stewart that his Cosworth Ford only had 8 cylinders. In a devastating lap on dry Friday, he set a time 1.2 seconds faster than second man Jackie Ickx. The Scot was in superb form. For Andretti, there was only commiseration under a shared umbrella. As the cars slid through a soggy Saturday session, the team managers were checking the weather forecast. It turned out to be good, and on race day, the sun shone down as the drivers lined up to welcome Prince Rainier and Princess Grace, arriving in an E-Type which, 10 years after its introduction, still looked good. The start, under the control of former Grand Prix driver Louis Chiron, was clean, and Stewart made the most of his pole position advantage to lead the pack as it screamed up the hill toward the casino in Monte Carlo. From Casino Square, the highest point of the circuit, the cars speed downhill, past the tip-top bar and into the Mirabeau hairpin. Then it's through the tunnel, onto the seafront and a tight hairpin that leads to the start and finish straight. Actually, it's a gentle curve and the start of yet another lap. Then it's up the hill again and the pattern of the race is starting to form. Stewart ahead of Siffert's BRM, Ickx in the Ferrari, Rodriguez BRM and Ronnie Peterson making a great impression in his march. Through Casino Square, the social hub of Monaco, but there's no time to admire it as the cars shoot downhill and then form an agonisingly slow snake through the station hairpin. Past the station, 2 right-hand bends take the cars into the tunnel, a test for the eyes and the ears. Then it's sunlight again and along the seafront before the left-right flick of the chicane, with a potential dive into the harbour on the left. In the history of the Monaco Grand Prix, just 2 drivers, Alberto Ascari and Paul Hawkins, have taken a dip, but neither was hurt. From a driver's point of view, the most frustrating aspect of the Monaco circuit is the lack of opportunity for overtaking. It's a question of biding one's time, waiting for the slightest mistake that will open up a gap to get ahead. The result is that the whole of the Principality vibrates to the sound of a crocodile of cars, engines echoing through the narrow streets and bouncing off the ornate architecture of Europe's top tax haven. While Stewart maintained a masterful lead ahead of Siffert, Ickx, Rodriguez and Peterson, there was plenty of action back in the pack. Tim Schenken needed new tyres after Sever's engine failed right in front of him and he was forced to take evasive action. Then Rodriguez flat-spotted a tyre, letting Peterson into 4th place, and Amon, who had been left behind at the start, was soon back in the pits again. Punishing his brakes and tyres, but never harming them, Stewart was totally in command of the race. Siffert drove brilliantly, but his engine failed at 3/4 distance, putting an end to what had started as a good showing by the BRM team. Apart from Stewart's drive, the talking point of the race was the performance of Ronnie Peterson. It was only his second appearance in Monaco, and to keep the relatively unproven March in contention with more experienced drivers in cars with better pedigrees would have been an achievement in itself. But when Rodriguez dropped out, the young Swede found himself 10 seconds behind Jackie Ickx. He made up the deficit within 21 laps, passed the Ferrari, and then 2 laps later passed Siffert to take over second place. He was no threat to the leader, but he was certainly the best of the rest. From now on, he was to be recognised as a driver of real talent. For Jackie Stewart, this race had been an object lesson in total control. Pole position, fastest lap, and first place almost half a minute ahead of his nearest challenger meant that the ruler of the Monaco Grand Prix had a date with the ruler of the Principality. For the second Grand Prix in succession, Jackie got to take Helen on a lap of honour, and after only 3 races, he had a 14-point advantage in the World Championship over the man in second place, Jackie Ickx. The photographers in Zandvoort for the Dutch Grand Prix couldn't get enough shots of championship leader Jackie Stewart. Jean-Pierre Beltoise driving for Matra and Henri Pescarolo in Frank Williams' team, together with BRM team leader Pedro Rodriguez, just didn't get a look in. Neither did Jackie's teammate at Tyrrell, Francois Sever, even though the young French driver might have been chosen by sponsors Elf as much for his film star looks as for his driving talent. No, the Scot was the undoubted star, the only driver who could keep a Cosworth V8 in touch with the Ferrari, BRM and Matra 12s. Surtees was the third fastest Cosworth-powered qualifier, and he was 7th on the grid. The Cosworth-powered teams were beginning to wonder whether the V8 had had its day, and questions were being asked about how Stewart could keep on winning when others couldn't match the more powerful 12s. It was down to a combination of driving skill, good design and superb preparation, but that was too logical an answer for some who were in the mood for an investigation. Among the 12-cylinder club, there was satisfaction with the power their engines developed, but frustration at the way Stewart could still manage to finish in front. Here in Holland, the final grid had 4 12s in the first 5 places, but third, smack in the middle of the sophisticated superpower units, was an almost mass-produced Cosworth, driven by that man Stewart. As practice progressed, it became obvious that the Ferraris were in good form, with Ickx fastest and Regazzoni 4th. Mario Andretti was disappointed to be down in 18th place. The marches, however, were not among the leaders. Fastest man Peterson was only 13th. Lotus was without Fittipaldi and had just 1:72 for Rainer Wiese. For Dennis Jenkinson, the British journalist whose name was synonymous with Grand Prix reporting, the battle of the engines just added to the interest. For Jenks, as he was known, there was nothing better than a vantage point out on the circuit where he could do what he loved most, appreciate the skills of the best drivers in the world. As the cars came in from final practice, word was coming through that rain was forecast for race time tomorrow. It gave the drivers plenty to think about. This Grand Prix, however, wasn't just a battle between 12 and 8-cylinder internal combustion engines. It marked the first appearance of the Lotus 56 gas turbine car with its Pratt & Whitney power unit. In the hands of Dave Walker, it proved to need a completely new driving technique. The weather forecasters had been right, and the race started in soaking wet conditions. All of a sudden, it wasn't engines that mattered, but tyres, and Jackie Stewart, together with the other Goodyear runners, had problems. Firestone, who supplied Ferrari, BRM, March, Lotus and Surtees, had a wet weather tyre that was far more effective than that of their rival, and the Goodyear runners were relegated to the role of mere spectators. Even Stewart, who desperately held on to third place in the early part of the race, spun at one point. At the head of the race, the sodden spectators were treated to a superb duel between two of the best wet weather drivers in the business. At a time when drivers didn't just compete in Formula 1, Jackie Ickx and Pedro Rodriguez were two of the best sports and endurance drivers around. Their experience in long-distance racing in all weathers had honed their skills on wet tracks to perfection, and it showed here. Time and again they swapped the lead, leaving the rest of the field in the curtain of spray that followed them. Eventually, Ickx got the upper hand, but Rodriguez never gave up the battle. When the pair were overtaking slower cars, even the organisers looked on in amazement. A third of the field either retired with mechanical failures or spun off, but Ickx and Rodriguez drove perfectly. Both lapped the entire field, including third-place finisher Clay Regazzoni. Jackie Stewart, winner of the two previous races and leader in the World Championship, finished a lowly 11th, but he was on Goodyear tyres. The first 8 cars home were on Firestones, so he was really third in class. 3 years earlier, it was Jackie who had the tyre advantage here at Zandvoort. In a similar wet race, his Dunlops had proved head and shoulders better than the opposition. It had been a crazy and eventful race, and the disorganised podium, which half of Holland wanted to share with Mr. and Mrs. Ickx, seemed a fitting end to it. This year, the French Grand Prix had a new venue, the Paul Ricard circuit in Provence, whose most impressive features were a massive pits complex and a main straight that went on forever. The straight posed problems for both drivers and mechanics. The track was exposed, so crosswinds could be a hazard. The extended use of maximum revs would put a strain on the engines. For the Cosworth teams, good preparation was vital. Brabham designer Ron Toranak and Graham Hill were engaged in the same task as all the rest of the teams, adapting the cars to a circuit they'd never raced on before. All along pit lane, drivers, engineers and designers were discussing the same problems. The process was the same for all. Discuss, adjust, and then try. Working conditions for the engineers and mechanics were superb. The pits complex at the circuit, with big garages, a media centre and restaurants, was unlike any other in the world. It was a pattern that all Grand Prix venues would have to follow. French driver Jean Max was making a one-off appearance in one of last year's marches. Fellow Frenchman Jean-Pierre Beltoise was now a regular member of the Matra Simca squad. He'd missed the first race of the season when his licence was suspended when he was blamed for an accident in a sports car race in Argentina. Ferrari's power might have been expected to give them an advantage here, but a new wide nose on his Tyrrell helped Jackie Stewart to take pole. He was almost a second faster than Regazzoni, while Ickx was third. Graham Hill, in a steadily improving Brabham, was fourth, ahead of Pedro Rodriguez. Everyone was focused on the start, but the recast circuit's closeness to the beaches of the south of France meant that for some, the atmosphere was more relaxed. At the start, as the sun glinted on the cars and the heat haze reflected off the tarmac, Stewart shot into the lead. As the field came round for the second lap, the Scotsman was ahead of Regazzoni and Rodriguez. Ickx had lost places when he tangled with another car. As the season progressed, it was becoming clear that Stewart's success was greatly helped by the Tyrrell team's technical innovations. For this race, the Tyrrells had new wide noses. In the previous Grand Prix at Zandvoort, they had introduced new air boxes, which fitted on top of the engine and had the effect of forcing air into the intakes. In the 3 weeks since Holland, both Brabham and McLaren had copied the idea. Most of the corners on the circuit were fast sweepers, but the sharp right-hander leading onto the straight was tricky. Among others, it caught out Henri Pescarolo. Pescarolo's car from last year had been hired out to local driver Jean-Max. He finished, but pit stops and slow progress meant he covered insufficient distance and didn't figure in the official results. It was his one and only Grand Prix. Tim Schenken had been going well in the second Brabham, getting up to 5th position, but then, with just 5 laps to go, he was out with low oil pressure. As Stewart flew by, Rodriguez walked in, his BRM out with ignition trouble. For Stewart, however, nothing could go wrong. He led from start to finish, and when the flag finally fell, he was 28 seconds ahead of the second finisher, his teammate Francois Sever. It was their first 1-2 finish, a milestone for the Tyrrell team. And so the scene changed to Silverstone, one of the fastest circuits on the tour, for Jackie Stewart's home event, the British Grand Prix. There's always more pressure on a driver on home ground, and Jackie, together with Ken Tyrrell and Goodyear tyre boss Leo Mel, were working hard to ensure a good result. Some of the overseas drivers at Silverstone could be more relaxed, but Francois Sever was also aware of the expectations that weighed heavy on the Tyrrell team as he and Stewart prepared to take to the track. The loss of 3 top drivers the previous season had made all aspects of safety very important to everyone in Formula 1, and Jackie Stewart was taking a leading role in persuading circuit owners and organisers to make tracks less hazardous. But just a week before Silverstone, there'd been another loss, when Pedro Rodriguez died in a sports car race in Germany. As they pulled on the fireproof hoods that they wore under their helmets, the drivers must have been aware of the dangers they faced from their greatest enemy, burning fuel. Technically, there were few changes for this race, although having seen the Tyrrell's new nose, Ferrari and BRM were experimenting with attachments that smoothed the flow of air over the front wheels. Lotus was experimenting again with a turbine-powered Type 56, driven by Rainer Wiesel. Its four-wheel drive was a theoretical advantage, but the driving technique required to achieve the maximum from its gas turbine was difficult to master. Once again, Stewart set the fastest time in practice, but he was not on pole. Regazzoni set an equal time and set it before Jackie did, so his car took the inside of the front row. The third car on the row was Siffert's BRM, but the second row was all Cosworth, with Fittipaldi ahead of Peterson. There'd been rumblings about the power of Stewart's Cosworth, and in France its fuel had been checked and found to be perfectly legal. Questions were still being asked, however, and plans were afoot to strip and measure the Tyrrell's engine after this race. The results proved it complied with the regulations in every aspect. But by now, the other Cosworth runners were catching up on the Tyrrell and the complaints died down. As the cars moved forward to the grid, there were plenty of Ford-powered drivers who felt they could give the Scot a run for his money. As the noise rose to a crescendo, the pack took off in a haze of exhaust fumes and tyre smoke, leaving behind Jackie Oliver's McLaren and Graham Hill's Brabham, which Oliver had run into. Approaching the end of the first lap, the order was Regazzoni, Stewart, Siffert, Ickx, Peterson, Schenken, Holm, Ganley, Gethin, Fittipaldi, Sever, Stommelen, Amon, Pescarolo, Beltoise, Beutler, Surtees, Gethin, Walker and Bell. The two Ferraris had led initially, but as lap 2 began, Stewart was already past Ickx and in pursuit of Regazzoni. The Swiss fought to hold on to the lead, but roared on by his home crowd, it didn't take long for Stewart to find a way past. From the fourth lap, the Scot was in the position he was becoming accustomed to, first. Behind him, Siffert got past Ickx and Regazzoni to take second place, then lost it again as his car developed a vibration. Peterson and Fittipaldi were also among the front runners, and when the two Ferraris had to drop out with engine problems, the Swede and the Brazilian took over second and third places. But they were strictly also Rams. Stewart was 36 seconds ahead as the flag fell, and at the halfway point in the championship, he led Ickx, his nearest challenger, by 42 points to 19. The champagne tasted good, and although the vehicle provided for the lap of honour was utilitarian, it did provide space for all the team that had contributed to the win. After a year's absence, in 1971 the German Grand Prix returned to the classic Nürburgring. The drivers had refused to race there in 1970 because it was too dangerous, but millions of marks had been spent on crash barriers and runoff areas, and once again the track was deemed ready to host a Formula 1 race. But safety campaigner Jackie Stewart and some of the other drivers had serious faces as they considered the prospect of taking on the tortuous 14 miles once again.
Neither Peter Gethin of McLaren nor Mike Beutler, entered in a March, had raced a Formula 1 car here before. But sports car specialists like Joe Siffert knew the circuit well from the 1,000-kilometre race. But it's unlikely that Gene and Louis Stanley, regal members of the family that controlled BRM, would attend any race that wasn't a Grand Prix. Helmut Marko of Austria had one of last year's McLarens, but he failed to qualify. Holm in the latest model was 6th on the grid, but teammate Gethin was 19th. Joe Siffert was the fastest BRM, taking 3rd place. Chris Amon, who was finding the Matra V12 of little advantage here,
was 15th. Vic Elford, the sports car specialist who'd been drafted into the BRM team, didn't look at ease. The carousel curve with its unique concrete banking was still recognisable as part of the track first opened in 1927. In fact, the course had been little changed by the update, but the old corners all had new safety features in the form of Armco barriers and gravel traps. It wasn't the original Nürburgring anymore, but it still had a unique atmosphere. The modifications had made the track faster. Stewart's pole time of 7 minutes 19 seconds was 21 seconds faster than that set by Ickx in 1969. Ickx was second this year, ahead of Siffert and Regazzoni. Once again, it was Stewart's Cosworth against the 12s. Although Ickx had led the rush into the first corner, he was only able to hold off Stewart for a few hundred yards, and as the cars set off from behind the pits complex and into the forest, the Tyrrell was ahead. The Ferraris were proving difficult to handle, and Ickx went off the track on the first of the 12 laps, leaving Stewart in an isolated first place. Regazzoni, who'd inherited second position, found it difficult to hold off Siffert, and on lap 2 his fellow countryman was past him. There had been no major motorsports events in Switzerland since racing was banned in the country in the wake of the 1955 Le Mans disaster. This wasn't enough to kill off the enthusiasm of Swiss drivers, however, and the fact that both Siffert and Regazzoni had both reached Formula 1 without the benefit of being able to race in their own country proved this. In addition to the two drivers, Ferrari's team manager in 1971, Peter Schetti, was also Swiss. On the 6th lap, suspension damage forced Siffert into retirement, leaving Sever and Regazzoni leading Stewart's pursuers. On lap 7, the Frenchman got ahead, and that's the way Helen Stewart's lap chart showed it at the finish, with Sever second and Regazzoni third. Andretti was fourth, ahead of Peterson, but with Tyrrell's second successive 1-2 finish, there was no doubt which team was currently on top. Stewart and his chief mechanic had good reason to smile. The last time Jackie Stewart won here, it had been in rain and fog in 1968. This time, the sun was shining, but his domination of the race was just as comprehensive as it had been 3 years ago. This was the second year that the Austrian Grand Prix had been held on the new Österreich-Ring, which was vying with Silverstone for the title of the fastest road course on the Grand Prix circuit. In 1970, the winner's average here had been just over 129 miles an hour, and Stewart had won this year's Silverstone race at just over 130. The question was whether that figure would be beaten this weekend, but it wasn't the only figure that was attracting attention. As Ken Tyrrell and Jackie Stewart prepared for a race that could win the championship, the March team were looking after a young Austrian driver in his first Grand Prix. The name of Ronnie Peterson's temporary teammate was Niki Lauda. Graham Hill's Brabham was steadily improving, and he would share the fourth row of the grid with teammate Tim Schenkel. Conditions were perfect in practice, and the lap speeds hinted that the race pace would probably surpass that of Silverstone. The fastest time was set by Joe Siffert in his BRM. He took pole ahead of Jackie Stewart. An increasingly confident Francois Sever was third, followed by Clay Regazzoni and Emerson Fittipaldi, another driver who was steadily improving. A good result for Jackie Stewart would give him the championship here, but there was still a mathematical possibility that Jackie Ickx could win the title. Nevertheless, the Scot looked confident. With practice over, race day was bright and warm. Back in the days when race control could be set up in an exported London bus, the pre-race show was less extravagant than it would be today. Joe Siffert's start was evidence that today was his day. He shot into the lead ahead of the Tyrrell's and Regazzoni's Ferrari, and for the rest of the race, no one could challenge him. His BRM's engine had new cylinder heads, and the power they provided, together with his determined driving, was the key to victory. Behind Seppi, as Siffert's fellow countrymen called him, the pace was furious. Lauda dropped out with engine trouble while lying next to last, but the Tyrrells were on top form. The action wasn't just among the leaders. The spectators could watch close battles throughout the field, but for the marshals, it was sometimes too close. John Surtees was another retirement, but he wasn't the only driver with problems. A vibration had appeared at the rear of Stewart's car in practice, and it was still there as the race progressed. After 22 laps, he had to give best to his young teammate, falling to third. Then, 20 laps later, the reason for the vibration showed itself when a rear half-shaft broke and he lost a rear wheel. He spun to a halt without injury to himself or further damage to the car. But as he made his way back to the pits, he did it knowing that Jackie Ickx had also retired and could not beat him in the championship. Like the McLaren team, Tyrrell had a broken car to take home, but their driver was the new world champion. For the BRM pit crew, it was a great day. Siffert had dominated the race, taking his second Grand Prix victory by finishing ahead of Fittipaldi's Lotus and Schenken, at last earning the podium place he deserved for Brabham. To the frustration of the British organisers, Siffert's average speed of just over 132 miles an hour confirmed the Österreichring as the fastest road circuit in Europe. After racing in Italy, where Peter Gethin gave BRM another victory and Jackie Stewart retired, the circus moved on to Canada and temporary accommodation at the Mosport Park circuit outside Toronto. Gethin's place at McLaren was taken by Mark Donoghue in a car entered by Roger Penske. Donoghue's information feedback was much appreciated by the team, which missed Bruce McLaren's abilities in this area. At March, designer Robin Hurd was on hand to swap information with Ronnie Peterson, and the arrangement was bringing good results. Helmut Marko was in a BRM, while Skip Barber had a March. Jean-Pierre Beltoise returned to Matra after another period in which his licence was suspended as the result of the accident at the beginning of the year. Getting a comfortable seating position and a clear view was going to be important in this race, for the weather was miserable. The Goodyear wet weather tyres had been much improved, and Jackie Stewart used them to make a fine start from pole. Joe Siffert's Firestones gave him good grip too, but Francois Sever, on the outside of the front row, didn't judge things quite so well. As the slow motion replay shows, he effectively spoiled the start for one half of the grid as the cars behind him had to slow down. Seifert slid off the track on the frenzied first lap, and Ronnie Peterson, who'd been back on the third row of the grid, but not on the side held up by Sever, was the surprise challenger to Stewart. Although he had to stop for new goggles at one point, Donoghue drove carefully to move up into third. But despite a half spin, Peterson was the only driver capable of staying anywhere close to Stewart. Andretti and the other Ferraris were having a poor day, with pit stops and a general lack of grip. Everyone was suffering from the same problems, and the organisers decided to stop the race with 64 of the 80 laps completed. The result added another 9 points to Stewart's unbeatable total. The final Formula 1 race of 1971 was the US Grand Prix at Watkins Glen. Upstate New York could be very cold in October, but for a change, the weather this year was warm enough for sunglasses in the pits, and in the case of Ferrari designer Mauro Forghieri, a sun hat. Ferrari had entered 3 cars as usual, for Jackie Ickx, Mario Andretti and Clay Regazzoni. But a commitment to a rescheduled IndyCar race meant that although Andretti would have one day for practice, he would not be able to race. Emerson Fittipaldi had won this race last year, but Colin Chapman and the Lotus team had lost impetus with the death of Jochen Rindt. For them, this had been a season to forget. Ronnie Peterson, on the other hand, had made great progress. Another driver looking back on a successful year was Francois Sever. For him, designer Derek Gardner, team boss Ken Tyrrell, and of course Jackie Stewart, the results could not have been better. In the McLaren pits, Briton David Hobbs was taking Donoghue's place. Like Andretti, the American driver had to race his IndyCar this Sunday. At Matra, Beltoise was back, discussing with his engineers how to get the best out of the car. Ferrari used Andretti to get some test mileage during practice in car number 6. Regazzoni's was number 5, but Ickx's, carrying 4 in practice, raced as number 32. Today's system, in which cars carry the same number throughout the season, is much simpler. Graham Hill had the Brabham team's only example of this year's BT34 with its lobster claw nose. The fashion for wide noses, which Tyrrell had started, was spreading to other teams, and Brabham was trying this wide front end on last year's car, the BT33, driven by Tim Schenken. The Tyrrell team was so confident that it lent its spare car to American star Peter Revson. A less well-known local driver was John Cannon, another one-race specialist in the BRM team, alongside regular member Peter Gethin. While Graham Hill wondered whether to get a haircut, designer Ron Toranak grabbed a sandwich. The grid had an unusual look to it, with only one 12-cylinder car in the first 2 rows. Stewart, Fittipaldi and Hulme were all ahead of Regazzoni's Ferrari, and Sever was 5th. As the marshals ran through to check that all was well, lilac-suited starter Tex Hopkins prepared for his moment of glory. Hulme had led into the first bend, but Stewart was ahead as the field came past the pits for the first time. The Scot was showing the experience that saloon car specialist Chris Kraft obviously lacked. Revson wasn't going to increase his experience today either. He retired on the first lap. Work on lengthening the track had been finished only 2 days before the race, so any excursion raised a dust storm, which didn't help the drivers, whose fans were suggesting new names for the circuit's modified corners. Mechanical problems soon started to appear, but Rainer Wiesel's damaged wheel was self-inflicted. At least he didn't have to walk far to the pits. While Stewart continued to lead, Emerson Fittipaldi's chances of repeating last year's victory disappeared when a lengthy pit stop put him completely out of contention. He got back into the race, but was too far behind to qualify as a finisher. It was a fate that also befell Skip Barber in his march. The leading car was still a blue Tyrrell, but it was in the hands of Sever. Stewart's tyres had gone off and he was slipping back, while his number 2 led Siffert's BRM and Peterson's march. As the laps clicked away, Race Communications passed on the word to Tex Hopkins, who prepared for a repeat performance worthy of examination in slow motion. Sever's win completed a perfect season for a Tyrrell team that had dominated the World Championship. Their young French driver was proving a perfect complement to Stewart, and the combination of youth and experience was a tribute to Ken Tyrrell's ability as a talent spotter. Sadly, 3 weeks after the US Grand Prix, there was one final stroke of tragedy when Joe Siffert was killed in a non-championship Formula 1 race in England. 1971 had proved to be a memorable racing year, in which, with 6 wins, Jackie Stewart had proved a worthy champion. Ronnie Peterson's second place marked him as a talent for the future, as was Sever in third. In the Constructors' Championship, 7 wins made the Tyrrell team unchallenged leaders as they upheld the honour of the Ford Cosworth engine against more sophisticated opposition.